Now you know how the main mechanisms, the main components of the simulation works. Finally, I want to show you just a few aspects of the output that where we use the distribution of the population of the household and the workplaces to make some basic measures. You see this if you run the model. We always see these values are changing. So here we have a distribution map that just plots the values of the population and workplace density, which is of course taking one row after the other, and then plots the number of households in a cell. And you see here in my central place I have a lot of households. That's the red line, and the workplaces are distributed more equally. And you remember this is based on the exponential decrease curve that is not that steep for workplaces, so the distribution just looks different. This is something you can also check in an abstract way with this output diagram. Another interesting value is the traffic measure. So we can make a very, very rough estimation on the traffic that's generated by my land use pattern that I create with the simulation. Means the distribution of workplaces and the distribution of households, they cause certain traffic because I assume that people in a household, they need to travel to the work and back every day, for example. And we can estimate how much traffic is caused by this land use pattern and compare it to another land use pattern. So we can try to find out if a certain distribution or a certain logic of our model causes more or less traffic. How does it work? So it's a very simple formula. What I do here is I compare all pairs of population or household distribution in the grid city with the workplace distribution. That's why I use a nested loop again to have this pairwise comparison. And I use my distances from my distance data tree. So for example, if I want to consider the distances from the first cell, I assume that's this one, then I'm in branch of the index I, and I take out the distance value in the list of values k, means this is probably the distance to myself, would be 0, and then the distance to this cell and the next cell, and so on and so on. So the same logic as we've already seen it for the computation of the attractivity map. And then I have a trip estimate value, which works in a way that I take the current distance that's computed here and multiply it with the population that is located in the cell that I consider, multiplied by the workplace that I find at the other cell which I look at in a certain distance. So if I have a lot of workplaces, for example here, and I'm here, then I would have, depending on the distance, so and so many traffic that I cause. And I divide it by all workplaces because I want to have only a fraction of all workplaces in this cell. So this part of the term is the fraction of the workplaces in a cell to all workplaces. And with this, I get a rough estimation. If I have distributed 261 households and workplaces, I will get a traffic, and this has not a specific unit, but it's just a value that I can use to compare it with a different land use distribution. So it's 1119, just remember it. And if I change the logic of my model so that people, for example, don't like to be close to others, we can see if the outcome of my model, if the traffic increase or decrease with a different model logic. So what have we visualized here? Can check this. So we see the distribution of the population. That's my visualization, and I run it just for 25 iterations, and I'm observing the traffic that's caused by this pattern. So you'll see, aha, it's really much more traffic that I generate with this logic after 25 iteration. And before we have had 1100 something, and now I have nearly 1500. So it's really a remarkable amount more traffic that I create if the population is distributed more or less equally in my city, compared to a very central core that I have in my city with the workplaces distributed correspondingly. So that's just an interesting observation that you can already detect consequences of different land uses. That is the consequence of different logics that you implemented in your model. And that's your first playground. So the simulation, the idea is that you should play around with it, explore the rules, explore the outcomes. Maybe you can implement new measures, because what you do here, that's reusable for the following simulations, because that's our basic setup. In the next step, we primarily change the spatial representation to make it more realistic, to have more realistic distance measures and more realistic geometries. But the logic stays the same. So try to understand the whole story here, play around with it. That's the best basis that you can have for the following steps. So with this module is ended. So now you have an idea what the grid city is, how it works, and good luck with exploring its dynamics.